welcome to SHARE, a podcast production of Amethyst Recovery Centers. I'm your host, Kabir Singh. At the top of each episode, we'd like to remind our listeners that addiction is treatable and recovery is possible. If you need help with substance abuse disorder, call Amethyst at 855-80-SOBER or visit us online at amethystrecoverycenters.com. Today, we're going to take a step into the world of clinicians who provide addiction treatment. Many clinicians are in recovery themselves, and there is an unfortunate phenomenon called compassion fatigue or vicarious traumatization. This is when a care provider experiences secondhand trauma or fatigue from hearing the struggles that patients and clients are living through themselves. It can take a toll on providers as their well-being and otherwise are compromised. But luckily, there are ways to mitigate those feelings. Our guest today is therapist Hannah Elise Rose, who worked for 5 years as an addictions counselor and now runs her own private practice. Hopefully, she'll shed some light on this topic and help other providers learn how to look out for compassion fatigue. Hannah, welcome to SHARE.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us as well. So it's really neat, as many of the listeners have likely heard in previous podcasts, or sometimes there's folks in recovery, sometimes there's allies in recovery. Somebody, a particular person before was in outreach, and that's sort of very homogenous with those who work in treatment and guide people towards treatment. But you are actually a clinician, a high-level clinician, and you're in recovery yourself. So the question begs, what got you in the field of addiction treatment?
Yeah. So before I got sober, I always knew I wanted to be a therapist. And, there's kind of like a saying in the therapeutic world that the people that don't want to deal with their own issues often go into a field where they deal with others. And so could be looked at as a defect, eventually used as an asset, right? And so I was a psychology major in college. I got sober in 2011, the night before my senior year of college. And, obviously getting sober at that age really gave me some advantages and benefits with actually finishing school on time and being able to go to graduate school. So I pursued my master's at Johns Hopkins, which was probably the first miracle of my sobriety that they let me in, because I almost failed out of college because of my drinking. And, I always said throughout my whole training process, since I got sober, I never want to be an addictions counselor. I always said that. I'm never going to work with addicts. It's too close to home. I'm in recovery and I know all about burnout. Of course, man plans, God laughs. And my first internship, I just happened to get placed at some very poorly run Suboxone clinic in inner city Baltimore, which really affirmed my aversion to the addiction treatment world. But then I got an internship after that at an IOP in Towson, an intensive outpatient treatment center. And I fell in love with the work. I fell in love with working with people that had such intense traumas and defenses, and it was really life or death. Like the intensity of it drew me in, and it is so different than sponsorship. It is so different than just working with another alcoholic in the recovery world. And then from there, I worked at another IOP in Bel Air, and then I worked at an inpatient location in Havre de Grace, and I was there for almost 5 years, and it really changed my life.
That's incredible. So you've moved around from certainly different programs. You mentioned the MAT program. You mentioned different levels of care. And I can relate a lot to what you mentioned about sort of wanting to help in this sort of industry. Not so sure you wanted to be in addictions, but how, your plans are, our plans rather, are not always our own, and things work out the way they do. I entered the field as just a peer specialist. I am, unlike you, not as smart, and did not want to go through years and years of school after undergrad. And really, it was incredible at that time because Maryland was offering the peer specialist track. And so I was one of the first group to go upon that. But one of the things I have noticed in my own recovery as it blends with the work that I do, or the constant working with patients, clients, those in the throes of addiction. And what happens on a day-to-day basis, with triggers and the like, and they're often unavoidable. What's your experience with triggering events, perhaps a story that's like yours, or the transference that may take place?
Well, I think the first really helpful thing I was ever taught about transference and countertransference is to normalize it. Like, it's going to happen. And there's these taboo things that can really elicit shame in clinicians. Like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I'm a therapist. I should have my life together. Or, oh my God, I shouldn't be attracted to a client, which is, side note, the most human, normal thing. But what happens is if we repress it and don't talk about it in supervision, that's where it can manifest into something unhealthy. So normalizing transference, normalizing, wow, this, female who's middle-aged alcoholic really reminds me of my mom, right? Like, acknowledging, okay, first I need to identify what my emotional triggers are. And so it is imperative for a new clinician, I say any clinician in general, anyone that works with others in general, to be in their own therapy. Because unless we can resolve our unresolved wounds, those wounds are going to leak out into our work, period. And so the more that we heal, the less anything outside of us, and this is personal life or professional life, has the capacity to trigger us in a way that rocks our foundation of self. So therapy is my go-to therapy.
Therapy. And so I identify with this 12-step fellowship. I think you do too. And so I think that as well, combined with the therapy, and that sort of deep digging that continues to take place. And over time, it has been my experience, it levels off. And I'm better able to deal with the crises that take place at work and not sort of make it my own. It sounds like you've done a really, really good job of that and can continue to do so. What does that, look like for you? Is it another colleague that you work with in the therapist, realm, or is it actually just a professional totally outside, somebody you don't even know?
Yeah, well, my experience, when I was working at an inpatient location, I mean, I was lucky to work with some of my closest friends who some were in recovery, some were not. And so having that constant peer supervision was phenomenal, just to be able to talk to my colleagues about specific patients and what it was bringing up in me and have that fellowship. I'm now in private practice where it's just me. And so the absence of that was also a big transition. But to answer your question, about 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, when I was working at that first IOP and experiencing a lot of patient death for the first time, as an intern, it was recommended to me from someone in the program to seek outside help, just like our big book tells us. And so I started seeing a therapist who specializes in addiction, which wasn't the presenting problem at the time, but also trauma and vicarious trauma. And she's just a phenomenal woman. And I've worked with her consistently as my therapist for the last 5+ years. And I would say, second to AA and working the 12 steps thoroughly with a sponsor, numerous times, and that engagement, therapy changed my life. It was like AA got me sober. It was like getting a bachelor's degree in how to live and be a good person. And therapy was like getting a, metaphorical doctorate in how to have a relationship with myself and better my relationships with others.
Incredible. I heard a couple breadcrumbs drop there in that IOP. Which relate to our topic, the compassion fatigue. What are the signs, or I don't know if this is the right word, symptoms of so I guess they're symptoms, right? They're symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Compassion fatigue. Yeah. So actually, compassion fatigue is a symptom of vicarious trauma. And so just to lay it out, okay, when you spend your life, and this doesn't have to be just clinicians, this can be anyone. This can happen when you're sponsoring someone, right? Is when we are listening to somebody else's trauma and someone sharing their wounds with us, depending on our level of emotional boundaries and ability to have empathy and detachment at the same time, which is a learned skill, I have found, what happens is we actually can have a visceral brain and body reaction to their trauma like it's ours. And so one of those symptoms is compassion fatigue, which means exactly how it sounds, is that over time, our ability to have compassion for others and empathy fatigues. Just like when you're working out and your muscles fatigue, it's like it stops working at that max capacity that it used to. And so I absolutely have noticed that at different points in my career where I just didn't have as much empathy, or my compassion for others' wounds, I had to harden to survive. And that was a big red flag for me. And so the first kind of, if one is looking at their own red flags, is, okay, do I have the capacity to feel compassion and empathy for others? Am I getting more irritable, restless, discontent? It can look very, very akin to untreated alcoholism, but sober. And so when our personal and professional relationships start to suffer because our bandwidth for empathy is getting smaller and smaller, that is a huge red flag that we cannot think or will our way through.
Interesting. That sheds a lot of light on it for me. And thank you for really highlighting the fact that it's not just clinicians, because you sort of went into how it could be in a sponsorship role. There's a lot of folks that are listeners that are in 12-step recovery and have that particular role. And so I really, really sincerely appreciate you shedding that, putting that color on that for us. So let's talk like a little bit of the recovery stuff here, right? An attitude of gratitude. I know it's often said to me by my sponsor and others in the fellowship, a grateful mind, there's very little else can get in the way of occupying a grateful mind, right? Little else can come in when I'm in a place of gratitude, and that occupies this space in between these two ears. In your own recovery, how has taking an attitude of gratitude helped you? It's sort of a blend of, combat the feelings of compassion fatigue over the years.
Well, here is probably an opinion that you may not have expected. I tend to be a little bit of a controversial voice in recovery, but while I think gratitude is a phenomenal asset, I actually recently did an interview with a radio station about gratitude shaming, and how when we're experiencing pain or compassion fatigue or frustration, we can inadvertently gratitude shame ourselves, which is a term I made up, where we say, I shouldn't feel this way, I should feel grateful. And I think it's important to note that shoulding on self is not the same as authentic gratitude. There's faux gratitude and there's authentic gratitude. And so for me, authentic gratitude plays a huge role, but also reconciling. And this was like groundbreaking for me as someone who liked concrete black and white thinking for a long time as a means to feel safe. Multiple truths can exist. I can be really resentful at, a toxic work environment, hypothetically, and grateful to be employed at the same time. I can feel deep wounds and pain about some family stuff that went down as a kid, and really love and respect and feel supported by my parents. And when we can start to embrace that ambiguity, multiple truths existing, we get to hold more space for authentic gratitude. So when someone says, I'm really stressed out, but I should be more grateful, I have a BS button in my office that I often press, because that is BS. I can be stressed and grateful at the same time. It's not mutually exclusive. So gratitude has played a huge role in my life, but understanding that forcing gratitude in an inauthentic way does no longer have a place in my
life. I appreciate the sort of challenge you put out there for that. That's an interesting way to look at it, and it makes sense. I can see that as I hear that from you, that they're not mutually exclusive, that they can coexist. And that's important to hear, because I can often fall into that exactly like you said. I need to be more grateful in this particular situation that whatever it is, the order was wrong at the quality of my problems today, right? Like they didn't put the guac in my Chipotle.
That's a big deal. Yes, right. Perspective taking is huge, and being able to step outside of our bubble, but also, and to me, this reminds me of the amends process. And I am one of those people that totally subscribe to making amends to ourselves, because we can be sober and help everyone else and still experience self-loathing and imposter syndrome. One of my favorite topics, with these self-deprecating comments that I got no time for. And if we can just acknowledge, like, yeah, my problems are way better than they were, but my problems are still real. And can I find that balance between not digging a hole and getting comfortable in it, but acknowledging, yeah, you know, I'm self-employed today. I'm in private practice. That is so wonderful. And there are some days where I feel burnt out and overwhelmed. And that doesn't mean I'm not grateful. It means I am human and get to experience the full spectrum of human emotion. And the more I can show up for those emotions authentically instead of try to put on the mask of perfection, for me, it's very helpful to not be on social media anymore to be more authentic. It creates more space for authentic connection with myself and others. And to me, that's like the number one thing that treats burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. It's authentic connection. When our instinct is to shove it down and say, I should be stronger than this, or I shouldn't deal with this.
Could you detail a little bit about the vicarious traumatization? I know you touched upon it before. We certainly talked a bunch about the compassion fatigue. Vicarious traumatization, if perhaps the listeners out there are not entirely
Absolutely.
clear.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't want to vicariously traumatize anyone listening, so I'm gonna peel back on some details. But I mean, even the other day, a client was telling me about her childhood trauma in detail, which was a necessary part of our therapeutic process, and I felt it in my body. I felt my body tense up. I immediately after the session, I walked downstairs, and I just sat on the couch with my dog, very therapeutic, and I felt tears in my eyes. It was, you know, I'm so glad that I create my schedule and I'm lucky enough to be able to do this in a way that it's not back to back to back to back clients, which I sometimes experienced in treatment, because we have to create space to nurture ourselves. It's like hearing someone else's trauma when you're truly empathetic and have the capacity to put yourself in their shoes to a certain extent with boundaries. It should affect you, right? If one is immune to vicarious trauma, I would argue that they have been so hardened and desensitized and are experiencing compassion fatigue. And so it's confusing because it's like your brain and body can have a traumatic response to somebody else's trauma. And that can only happen if we have enough empathy. But we're also taught to have just enough empathy where we're not going to be crippled by vicarious trauma and burn out. And so that's where self-care comes in, is to be able to hold space for other people's pain. And again, this goes well beyond the reach of therapists or clinicians or even people working in treatment. This is just humanity and how we connect. And if we don't have room for self-care because busy bees, that's the American culture, we burn out. It's just like we have a culture of burnout.
Self-care is the overwhelming word for me here is self-care. I mean, it just keeps in every aspect of what you're saying, whether it's through therapy, through whether it's a peer role, whether it's through supervision at work, meditation, things, you know, that are, natural supports, things like that. So I loved how you said, don't should all over yourself. I haven't heard that in years. I heard it before. Listen up, folks, don't should all over yourselves. And,
right.
and that's really important for us to take into account. They say when you only take care of others, your needs are not always met. What are some other things that you do for self-care? You shared a bunch with us, and I heard something about the dog. I can definitely relate to that. Yes. What kind of dog?
He's a miniature Aussie doodle named Ralph. He is my son, and I got him in this quarantine. Actually, he'll be a year old in 2 days.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
wonderful.
But self-care. So, even when I just think back to this past year, March to now, my self-care has looked so different at different levels of sanity and the way, we're in a global trauma right now. We are. And even though it's been normalized and we feel desensitized to like COVID life, the fact that COVID and hopefully social distancing has really gotten in the way of being able to connect with others and like physically, at least, it totally changes our lives. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, self-care was survival mode. I was in a 9-week intensive trauma course. So that was also like vicarious trauma, but the presenter was really phenomenal in like nurturing us through the early stages of the pandemic while learning about some of the most difficult topics in the world. But so I remember I used to color, like coloring books. I reverted back to, okay, what did I like to do as a kid? I bought rollerblades. I was rollerblading around Patterson Park for the whole beginning of the pandemic because my knees aren't great and I can't run and I'm not I have a Peloton now. Highly recommend if that's in one's ability, by the way, life-changing. But so I would rollerblade, I would color. If you look behind me, I bought a ukulele and I taught myself the ukulele, and I would spend hours just singing and playing the ukulele. Like at one point I bought a Nintendo Switch on eBay because they were all sold out, and I would play Animal Crossing for hours. And that is what I needed. Now my self-care looks so different. I discovered my love of reading for the first time since, I don't know, whenever I was a kid and read Harry Potter. That's my self-care now. And so we need to be lenient enough to listen to what our brain and body needs and not do performative self-care, which is like, okay, I'm supposed to meditate, so I'm going to meditate to check it off my list. You know, I had a 45-day streak, or maybe it was 180 days. Yeah, it was a long streak of meditation in this pandemic. And at one point I realized I'm not even meditating for me. I'm meditating just so that this streak continues. Like the motive became more external. And so the more honest we are with ourselves and what we need, like, yeah, I love yoga, but if we only do yoga because we think we're supposed to, it stops being authentic. Like that word I'm always going to use. And so self-care could be so many different things. And it's different for everyone. And so like when I have clients say, like, well, what should I do? I really put the ball back in their court and say like, well, what would feel good for you? You know, if you got rid of shame and obligation and pressure and expectations, like what would you want to do? And I think this pandemic is actually a great opportunity for us to explore that and like tap into what makes us feel joy.
That's incredible. You've definitely done the work. You've been at it for a while. You figured out what works for you. I encourage the listeners out there to try a bunch of these healthy, outlets in their own lives, these aspects of self-care, whatever they look like. So there you have it, folks. Self-care, I come from a real estate background, way like in a previous life. And there was 3 words in real estate, right? Location, location, location. Well, it sounds like the 3 words today for compassion, fatigue, and vicarious traumatization is self-care, self-care, self-care. So there you have it, folks. We hope that Hannah has provided some insight and strength and hope for how to deal with compassion fatigue if you are a care provider or a person in recovery helping someone else navigate their own sobriety. If you or a loved one needs help with substance abuse or co-occurring mental health disorder, call Amethyst today at 855-80-SOBER or visit us online at amethystrecoverycenters.com. Thanks for joining us for another episode of SHARE. I'm Kabir Singh, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.